Last Pint Productions presents the New Way podcast. The New Way contains adult content and is recorded in advance. The following episode was originally recorded on September 26th, 2021. Listener discretion is advised.
So you were in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah?
Were you in the shit?
Yeah, I was in the shit.
Last night, Darth Vader came down from planet Vulcan and told me that if I didn't take Lorraine out, that he'd melt my brain.
Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue.
We came, we saw, we kicked its ass.
Everybody wants to be naked and famous. Everybody wants to be just like me, I'm naked.
Will you help teach me about this? What is it? A new way?
Evening, listeners, and welcome to the New Way Radio Hour, where we reckon we'll tickle your ears with a little bit of moving pictures talk, so y'all don't need to have that theater discourse yourselves.
You're goddamn right.
I'm your trail boss, Marlboro Matt Shank, and I'm joined by my partner. Now, that's different than a partner. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but my partner, Benny the Kid Wilson. How are things on your ranch there, Benny?
You're goddamn right.
That's my partner. My partner, Ben Wilson.
Say.
That's all you're going to say?
You're goddamn right.
That'll be the whole podcast, is just going to be Sam Elliott-ish quotes out there. Hello, welcome to the New Way podcast. Yes, it's another Benny and Matt duo podcast, and you'll know why we had that intro just from the title of the episode. It's funny, sometimes we work our way into the topic, kind of, we try to make an interesting way into the topic, but everyone knows what the topic is because they can see it on the name of the episode.
It's right there. It's on iTunes.
It is the reason they tuned in or didn't tune in. That title. Yeah. So yeah,
Nick and Ryan definitely did not tune in for this episode.
No. And I do want to talk about our last episode as well, because there was some fun feedback on that. But we are doing a Western episode, which we will get to after we go through a couple of things. Now it is funny. We after the episode launched, immediately Ryan was messaging us to say that he was very happy that he was able to be the comic foil in my reinterpretation of events leading to that episode.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like we were getting a lot of feedback just all across the board. Just Patrick was chiming in with him being Patrick.
Yes. There were several times that Patrick spoke English words, and I've seen some of these words, but not in this particular order before, and I had no idea what was being communicated.
I also have to laugh because I don't have my wife's ring light on right now, so I'm in her office. And I look like Elijah Wood from Sin City.
Well, I've been watching all weekend Midnight Mass, so I'm also just terrified to look at the screen because Ben is just like a shadow monster in vaguely Ravens paraphernalia. So I'm on edge as it is, living alone and watching a horror anthology.
Well, let's talk about that, because I've only watched one episode, but I'm down. And Nick, of course, is of course very, very enamored with it, as is his wont, because it's biblical horror.
Well, and I'm also very much into. I do like a lot of biblical horror, especially. I mean, Ben and I have worked on a screenplay about frat boys going to hell, so I've always kind of liked that the mythology around it all. But I just before this podcast finished the 6th of 7 episodes.
I heard that the 5th episode is particularly good.
There are, everything in it is exactly what you should be expecting from Flanagan, which was kind of interesting because I know there was some discussion on our chat group thread of saying that they were expecting it to be more Hill House and Haunting of Bly Manor, whereas I feel that this is 100% the DNA of both of those shows, including the structure of how information is metered out to you and when you are going to learn things, and then what you do once you've learned the information. Like he is in a very comfortable wheelhouse. I think this one is I think he's trying a little bit more with the science versus faith kind of thing in it, and that works to and against, I think, things at certain points when you're kind of like, there's stuff happening here. I don't know that the science angle is really necessary, but it's kind of interesting. I'm trying not to spoil anything in it, but I'm enjoying it. I can't wait. I will probably watch the last episode after we finish recording tonight, and then scare myself. Although I have gotten to the point where it's a little less scary necessarily once you know sort of the.
You're gonna torture yourself.
I'm gonna yes, exactly. There are myriad reasons that is funny, and I can't talk about any of them. But but moving along. So there is something I've been dying to discuss with you, Ben. And
tell me it's Dear Evan Hansen.
It is absolutely Dear Evan Hansen. So I have not watched it yet, but I remember Ben telling me about the show, and Beth as well being very excited. They saw the show, they loved the music, they loved the show, and so I've been kind of excited. And I remember the first trailer dropped for Dear Evan Hansen, and everyone, it was getting the big issue was Ben Platt's age, and he's 27 and he's playing a 17-year-old, and maybe you can get away with that on stage, but you can't really get away with the film. And none of that even entered my brain. I couldn't get past the plot, and the plot was so like gross to me is the only word I could think of, and
sure.
and that seems to be the bigger problem, especially on film, and that's something that it probably worth a whole episode to talk, as we have talked a couple of times on air about musical adaptations. But there are these things that you can do on stage that work, and things that you can't translate like that to film. And I think the famous one, we've talked about is Little Shop of Horrors, where in the show, the main cast, all of the main cast is eaten by the plant. Everyone dies at the end of the show. The plant wins and goes on. And Frank Oz said, they shot it. They shot this amazing ending, which you have to go find because it's so great.
One of the greatest.
It's the greatest deleted scene that exists in any movie ever. And he goes, we test screened it, and people wanted to riot in their seats of like, how could you kill Rick Moranis and Ellen Green? What is wrong with you? And he's like, I forgot about a very simple thing. I forgot about the curtain call. I forgot that in a show, your actors get to come back out, you get to celebrate their performance and whatever happened to them, and you get that closure. And on screen, in a comedy where you don't get that, it's you feel betrayed by it. But I'm curious, Ben, as far as, because I don't think the plot changes at all movie to film.
Apparently it does a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Actually.
Like, were you with, because it's the plot line is very similar to another movie called, is it World's Greatest Dad, or I forget the title. It's one of Robin Williams' last movies, and the plot is that.
Yeah, I'm not really sure on that front. I mean, so the whole thing. Spoilers, by the way, for those of you.
I mean, it's in the trailer, and it happens early in the show. It's the whole plot of the show.
So Evan Hansen is a kind of a sociopath. He.
That's the greatest lead-in.
Yeah.
Well, we should discuss the plot so people know what the plot is. Saying sociopath is interesting.
So he kind of co-ops because he meets a guy who is not his friend, who he's writing letters to himself, and his not friend steals one of those letters and then commits suicide. And then he thinks his whole family thinks that he was actually writing letters to the main character. And he uses that to kind of ingratiate himself into this family, which is problematic. But here's the thing about the show. The show does not shy away from the fact that it's problematic.
Okay.
There's no happy ending. It's the antithesis of a happy ending. It's actually like, this guy is fucked up, and this is the links that people go to feel wanted, or like to feel like they're part of something. And it does not end happily. It ends very poorly for everybody involved. And the one saving grace is that his mom comes in the third act and is like, I don't care that you're fucked up. I love you.
Okay.
And that's kind of what you get is I've created this huge lie, and he's like, that escapes him. And he's like, I can't deal with it anymore. And she's like, I don't care. I love you. And that's what the message is supposed to be like that. I understand I haven't been there, and you need something more, from life and from me. And at the end, it's a very uplifting thing because he's still fucked up, and everything is still messed up. But he kind of comes around to the fact that he's like, yeah, I did a shitty thing.
Okay.
And there's no happy ending. And he's like, I'm going to try and do my best to make amends or to pay penance for what I've done.
All right.
So I think what happened with the movie is that they mistakenly said, oh no, Evan Hansen's the protagonist, because he is not a protagonist. He is absolutely not. He's mistakenly at some points, like, you can root for him because he's a nerd, but I think that what it sounds like, and I haven't seen the movie yet, but it sounds like they changed the ending.
Well, yeah, and I've heard, and one of the reviews I read did say, like, where the age thing does become an issue is that you're watching what should be like a 17-year-old make dumb 17-year-old mistakes, but it looks like a 40-year-old man. That's like that. You're like, this guy should know better. He's a psychopath, and it is very interesting because there is this movie directed by Bobcat Goldthwait called World's Greatest Dad, and the plot of that movie is similar in that his son winds up accidentally killing himself through like autoerotic asphyxiation, this really embarrassing death. And so he finds his son, and it's Robin Williams is the father, and he's like, "Oh my God, this is embarrassing for him." So like he moves the kid, and then he writes a suicide note, this like very poetic suicide note, because he's an aspiring writer. And everyone's like, "Oh my God, this note is amazing." So then he starts pretending that he's found more notes written by his dead son.
It sounds similar.
And it was just a very oddly weird, similar kind of ish plot. But yeah, I was just curious because like I very rarely is there such a divergence from like, because I've heard tons of people love that show, and even the fans of the show are just railing against the movie. And I was like, I was always kind of curious what that disconnect was on there. It's kind of fascinating.
Well, I mean, and I think you're right. I think you can get away with it on stage. Is it like, oh yeah, you can paint your main character as a sociopath, but it's like you're still rooting for him in the show, but you're allowed to do that because of the artifice of the show. Like, it's still, it's a stage. It's and I don't think that you're allowed to do that with a movie, because you're trying to get into a kid's head, not a kid, played by 27-year-old Ben Platt.
Yeah.
I mean, I fucking love Ben Platt, but that was the most miscalculated thing they could possibly have fucking done.
Well, and it's kind of crazy because the director is also a great choice. And it's the guy that did Perks of Being a Wallflower, which is a fantastically well put together
good
movie also about troubled kids, high school kids, and some of them doing things that aren't so great, and this deep trauma that's kind of buried in there as well. So yeah, I'm definitely going to watch it. I'd at least like to hear the music. I don't know much about that either, but
that's the thing, is like the music is so good, and it had a chance to be really, really fucking special, and I'm sad that it's not. But I really wish that they had I wish they had cast it with just a bunch of just complete unknowns, and just people who could sing, and just people who were unknown. I mean, that's the idea of the show, is like, you're not seen.
Yeah, and cast the adults the maybe as whatever. Like, those are your A-list stars.
Right. The whole thing is like, you will be found, is the idea of the show, is like, no matter what, no matter what creed or like what you prescribe to, you will be found, and that you're it's a super powerful show if you kind of stick to that. But you have to still understand that your main character is a sociopath,
which is a little bit tough pill to swallow. But yeah, I'm curious. I'm very curious to watch it. And of course, one of the main reasons I'm curious to watch it is because we are musical theater nerds. And next week we are recording. And if I can produce the edit quick enough that night, we will drop. Probably it'll be a day late, but maybe next Thursday morning. A week from this Thursday, we will be dropping our musical podcast, which have you recorded anything for yours yet, Ben?
I've written.
You've written yours.
But I have not recorded.
I wrote and recorded a chunk of something that I'm not going to use, and I'm just audibling now, and I'm scrambling, as has happened many times on the musical podcast. But
It's an interview with the vampire too.
I had ideas, Ben. I went through them, and then I got in front of the computer and a microphone, and it was bad. And it's going to be something. I don't know what it's going to be.
Who knows what's going to be?
And if I couldn't tell if Nick was kidding or not, and I won't say anything in case I am, but I sent him this clip from TikTok of someone that made a musical number off of a known film, and Nick was like, "Oh my god, that's what I was gonna do for mine," which is gonna be tough also because this person happened to actually do a really good version of this, so we'll see. But let's get into our topic, which is going to be this is, I think, 2 in a row where we've kind of tackled something. I mean, I know you're maybe a little bit more into this genre than I am, although I was kind of, so the topic tonight is Westerns, and there's, at least on my part, there's a misconception that like Westerns sort of disappeared just because they were so ubiquitous in the 60s. But like Westerns are still Westerns are still constantly happening now. Like when I went through my list, I'm like, there's fucking tons of even stuff that's not even just inspired by Westerns, which is an even bigger group of things.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that the thing is Westerns were an easy, like when Hollywood was first, a thing, basically, it was easy to do Westerns because it was like, hey, we're in Hollywood. Let's go to, let's go to the desert and we'll film a manly man doing this thing, and it became ubiquitous with kind of like, oh yeah, that's the man's man, being like doing the Western thing. In the same way, like cop dramas, we're big.
You say cock dramas or cop dramas?
Cop dramas.
That's 2 different things.
Like cock dramas.
Cock dramas are good. I mean, also good, but very different.
I think that people naturally matriculated away from Westerns in the 60s and 70s when avant-garde film kind of came around, and it was like, oh, people are getting a lot more, realistic and a lot more gritty, with your bullets and Serpicos and stuff like that.
Sorry, I realize with no context, the gun just sounds like crashing sounds out of nowhere. I'm so sorry that failed. That's someone shooting a duck or loading their gun.
But I still find it interesting that people look back on that period of film, especially like the Searchers, like the John Ford films of the late 40s and early 50s. And they're like, oh yeah, that's what a man is like that's the manly man or whatever back in those days. And it's really interesting just to kind of see that, because I feel like nowadays we've kind of come full circle on all of that stuff. But
well, I mean, that's a huge part of that genre, and we did a little bit of that when we did our action podcast, because we talked about how Westerns fall in that genre. But yeah, there's a lot of it's funny because we talked about I recently, or somewhat recently, had for the first time watched Escape from New York. And I was like, oh, I didn't love it because it felt like old school John Wayne, like Western stuff of like the silent gunslinger that rolls into town and like grunts out a couple of lines, and you're just like, oh my God, this guy is just like such a like man's man. Well, and that's never worked for me. And except that there are all of these movies that were done, especially in the last 20 years, where they've taken Westerns, and we're definitely going to talk about a few of them. I know there are some that Ben and I both have talked about that we love, where they really are using, instead of using of just this like landscape of where this is just an easy way to bring a guy in, he has no past and he has no whatever, and he's going to learn his lesson and stuff. I think they've gotten a lot better of using the convention of Westerns and things that they can do, and making really interesting stories from that. Even if they are, and it's not that I'm against something where there's a silence of a film. You look at something like Bone Tomahawk, which is also another version of Kurt Russell in like half of the Westerns that we're going to be talking about tonight. But that's a movie that is a lot of just silence and atmosphere, but it's done just in a completely different way than because there was no atmosphere to what was happening in those early Westerns.
I would argue that, I mean, one of the things I love about Kevin Costner, of course, it comes back to Kevin Costner,
always,
is Open Range, which is a movie that he wrote and directed. He was like, I haven't seen a true Western in a long time. And it is these kind of, sprawling landscapes and a lot of like long shots where you're not seeing a whole lot of stuff happen. And it all bubbles up to one huge like confrontation at the end of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I fucking love it. I love it so much. I think it's such a great film, and I think that it establishes early on like what it is, mm-hmm. and then you have your 20 minutes of violence at the end of the movie, and that the kind of what you're waiting to.
Where someone's going to get shot and fall off of a balcony outside to a Wilhelm scream, and then they're going to reset the backlot for the next show that comes through.
Right. But I've always I've enjoyed Western films, with understanding that there's this artifice. They don't, they follow this structure, and they. It usually involves people just being too uptight or too matter of fact about their ways or like whatever. And then you have this, where people go tete-a-tete, at the end.
Do you think you would have fared well in the Old West? You, Ben Wilson?
Fuck.
No, you have no desire to go to the Old West.
I would have died so early.
That is one of the things I do like. It's not a great movie, but what's it called?
I would have been Billy Bob Thornton in Tombstone.
Yeah, it's A Million Ways to Die in the West is a Seth MacFarlane Western spoof with the general idea that like everything in the West is built to kill you. Like everything is working against you in the West to stay alive. Because I feel the same way, Ben. Like I don't ever look at the West nostalgically. It's hot. People are wearing 17-piece wool suits in the desert in the heat, and I don't understand that. I will never understand that. And everything's just built to kill you. Like the only way I would work, I'd have to be a rich guy, and I would probably not be a rich guy, so I would be dead.
Yeah, no kidding.
I think you could maybe, I could see you like starting like a moonshine, or like running a saloon and making your own moonshine, artisanal moonshines.
I'm not sure that would work out.
It could. What was it when you were a kid? Like, what was your introduction to the concept of like cowboys?
Well, I was actually about to ask you the same thing, because I was like, what was the first Western that you ever saw? Because I can tell you mine.
I like, it's funny, for as long as I can remember, I wanted to be a gangster. No, I knew the phrase cowboys and Indians, like, which is now a terrible way to paint things. But I knew that phrase very little. And I know at one point,
imperialists and indigenous
yes,
people.
Exactly. And I know at one point, like, because my grandparents had horses and had a ranch, and like, so I knew about cowboy boots. But I think I was trying to think of this today for a long time. I'm pretty sure my earliest introduction was watching episodes of The Wild Wild West with my dad, which was
it was Gunsmoke for me.
The Wild Wild West was a like, it's one of those things. It pains me so much that the movie was a disaster for a gazillion reasons. I mean, it hurts just to watch Kenneth Branagh and Kevin Kline and Soderbergh and Will Smith just like flounder in this terrible script. But in general, the show also is just
at least they got the giant spider.
Yeah, exactly. Finally, Peter's got his fucking giant spider. It was such a great concept to take James Bond and put him in like post-Civil War West, and like, there were so many things they could have done to make an update of that could be fucking great. And it would, and then they sort of did that, and they made Maverick earlier than that instead, which was, I think, took all of what should have been the charm of Wild Wild West and just did it, a few years earlier in a much better movie.
Not like Maverick's that great, but
it's a crowd pleaser.
Yeah. And you have Jodie Foster, and you have like,
everybody in that knows exactly what fucking movie they're making,
exactly.
And they have a great time, and it's infectious. And that's a great use of just a fun, silly Western. But I think Wild West, and then, Blazing Saddles and Three Amigos were probably the other two biggest ones I had, just as far as like, I was watching comedies. I didn't want to watch Westerns. Like, what kid, in the 80s wanted to watch Westerns?
So I still remember everyone was like, as an aspiring, film kid, or whatever I was
eating your sushi and watching your Red, White, and Blue trilogy.
Everyone was like, you have to watch The Searchers, because The Searchers is, that, Western film that everybody has to watch. And I watched it and I was like, this movie fucking sucks. And I watched it recently, and that movie fucking sucks. It's a bad movie. It's really bad. I think it's actually one of John Ford's worst Westerns. And it's considered like this, beautiful film that's, in the fucking like Library of Congress. And I'm like, no, it's a bad movie. It's really a bad movie. In my opinion, it is a really bad film. And I like John Wayne when he's doing like his thing, obviously he has his own like
yes, his special delivery.
But that film is so weird and so like it's just so all over the place, and it doesn't have a clear message, and the message is kind of. Anyways,
well, I also think that obviously John Wayne's best performance is when he played Genghis Khan, but that's for another podcast.
I think he's better in 20,000 Leagues Into the Sea.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, John Wayne obviously has to be discussed in a discourse on Westerns.
It's John Wayne.
Like so Humphrey Bogart and John Wayne are two actors that I don't get. And I'm sure in 40 years, people are going to be saying the same thing about Tom Hanks and Harrison Ford, and saying these are just two guys that did the same thing in every movie. And maybe I'm missing some nuance.
I think you might have an argument for Harrison Ford. I don't think anybody's gonna say that about Tom Hanks.
You never know, man. You never know with the future, the new Ben and Matt, the new way that's gonna happen in 2069. But yeah, it's I think
Hanks was in Philadelphia.
This is true. I will let you know. Listen, I make Tom Hanks jokes at my own peril, knowing my history on the show, but. I think it is interesting, like, because I like True Grit. I think that's maybe the only John Wayne movie I genuinely actually enjoy watching. And I think they did a great job. I think the Coen brothers did a great job.
Because they did a good job of leaning into what he is, which is just this kind of like gritty, kind of badass. And
just he's a little older. It's a little like it's just it didn't.
He's ornery.
Yeah,
that's the idea. Like he's not, which I will talk about it, I'm sure, because I feel like it's permeated like popular culture. That's what makes something like John Wick so approachable, is that it's like this old guy that's like kind of out of touch and still fucking beats people's asses.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think that was also like almost all of those westerns. Your protagonist guys weren't like there was always a young cowboy that was there to bring in the female audience, but your lead was always somebody like and it's hard to tell because people aged like raisins in that time period. So like you look at the idea that like today Paul Rudd's the same age as Wilford Brimley was in Cocoon. That doesn't make sense to us. But like back then it was always this older grizzled gunfighter, and which they do a great job of that in Blazing Saddles with Gene Wilder. And it's that whole idea of like, I hung up my guns, years ago.
Well, to date, I feel like the best, my favorite Western film is Giant, which is obviously you have a magnetic lead with, and for those of you who have not seen Giant, watch Giant. It's not
and Ben's not talking about the movie with Billy Crystal and it's
I'm talking about the James Dean.
Yes. Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor, James Dean.
But what I would say is that movie is not a Western. Like it's a Western because it's not a Western. It's a family drama. And it just has the aesthetic of being, like existing. And I think that's what good Westerns do.
Sure.
It's like, okay, we stick this out here. And I don't know, like what your opinion of the film is, but one of my favorite Westerns, like outside of Giant, is Dances with Wolves. I mean, like Costner did a really good job with that film. Obviously it's the best picture winner, but he basically was like, yeah, I'm going to make a Western. And
it's funny. That's a film that I need to rewatch because I haven't I haven't seen that. I don't think I've seen that since it was out, like on video, first on video.
Entirely indigenous, like entirely for first people of the U.S. And yeah, he did a really good job of. Like,
I want to see that. I really think that most of my my Western interest movies, very much, like I said, they really have come out in the last 10 to 20 years. And they're not because I missed out on a lot of it. Like I was late to the game in seeing Unforgiven, which I think is I enjoyed quite a bit. Film. Yeah. And it's also, it's cast expertly well. It does a lot of the things that he does well, and not all of the things that he normally has been doing shitty for the last sometime years. I would say, because I'm not really a big Eastwood fan, but in front or behind of the camera, to be honest. But I think Unforgiven, and I think it's probably why I didn't watch it for a while. And then I watched it, I'm like, oh my god, this movie's fucking great. Like it's a great slow burn. Really Gene Hackman delivers a fucking phenomenal performance. But yeah, there was that, and then we had dueling Wyatt Earp projects that came out in the mid 90s. We had Tombstone and we had Wyatt Earp, and they really couldn't have been more different in Tombstone was the MTV rock and roll. For at least that's my interpretation. You've got Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday, just fucking chewing all of the scenery as he can, versus then you see Dennis Quaid do it in Costner's Earp, and it's much different.
It's so interesting because I watched Val
I've been meaning to ask about it. Was it good?
It was very good, and it seems like like Costner's project would have attracted Val Kilmer more.
Yeah. Well, and Tombstone is one of those like interesting movies that when you read up on it.
Oh, it was a shit show.
It was a disaster, a dumpster
It was directed
fire.
by 3 different people,
which was mostly directed by Kurt Russell. And in fact, I'm trying to remember what movie. I think it was it the director? It was the Waterworld director.
No,
I forget what other movie the guy that got fired essentially from Tombstone. Someone else hired him. Oh, it's Bruce Willis. It's a movie that never got made. I just learned this the other day. It was on some like trivia thing. There was this Bruce Willis movie that shot for I don't know. I want to say like 20 days. They ran out of funding, but the idea is Bruce Willis hired that director because Bruce Willis wanted to direct it, but couldn't get approval from the studio. So he's like, find me a director where the actor was able to like surreptitiously direct from underneath them, and the director didn't care. And they're like, the guy that did Tombstone, and that's how I hired it. And apparently it was a disaster. But yeah, Tombstone had all kinds of problems. But it's a fun fucking movie. I mean, I don't think that there's a lot of art in it, but who doesn't love watching that cast just fucking play cowboys for 2 hours?
Yeah, no, it ended up working out really well.
Yeah, and the Wyatt Earp is much more. It's slower. It's not. It's very much kind of an introspective piece. Much closer to Dances with Wolves. Really on it. But it is interesting to watch those movies side by side because you're getting kind of just these different parts of his character's life.
It was really interesting because it had been a long time since I saw Dances with Wolves, and I was like, how does Mary McDonnell like fit into things? I was like, obviously she's not Indian, like she's not a Native American, she's not an indigenous person, and I completely blocked out of my brain that she is a child and her whole family gets massacred, and it's very vivid and it's very like violent, and I rewatched it and I was like, holy shit, like they went for it, like Costner went for it, like he did not shy away from violence.
And I think that's a big turning point in and how Westerns evolved, because you've got everything that was happening in the 50s and 60s and before that. And then the 70s, we lose the genre a bit as we're getting, like you said, you get into cop dramas and you're getting into Scorsese.
All the tough guys went to procedurals. They went to cops.
And then in the 80s, you're mostly lampooning kind of the idea of the Western with, and you've got Blazing Saddles, and you've got Back to the Future 3, which is, a very silly Western, and of course spawned
What's wrong, dude? You yellow.
Which I just love to hear that. It's interesting because then you kind of have this shift after that mid 90s point when you start to get into the 2000s and Westerns are being revisited. They are very graphically violent, and they do not shy away from what was likely the truth. And I think, I think part of that is Deadwood. I think really kind of started to bring some of that, the idea of what this place actually was like. And that's the best. I think the thing that Deadwood does the best is you feel the grossness of that town, of just like everyone is dirty and filthy, and you've got this whorehouse and everyone's just gross. Even the rich people like can't really keep away from the grossness. And then I think you have a lot of filmmakers seeing that and seeing the popularity of that and realizing, oh, we can probably get funded. And I think that's where you find things like 3:10 to Yuma, which is a remake, but
such a great
phenomenally just. And I love that Ben Foster is in two of my favorite Westerns of the last decade.
Ben Foster in 3:10 to Yuma is one of the best villains of all time.
Yeah.
I will argue that to the day I die.
It is, if you're of any of all the movies on that we were talking about in this episode, I would say absolutely immediately go and watch 3:10 to Yuma, the new, the 2000, I forget, came out 2007.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just it's great, and it is directed by James Mangold, who went on to do Logan, which is also a Western. And as we kind of talk, we can briefly we talk about sort of where Westerns also evolved. There are things like Logan that is played very much the same as how a Western is, even though you're dealing with a superhero character, but very much taking that DNA. And I mean, I think the biggest one that everyone can see from the last few years is The Mandalorian, which is 100% a Western.
The silent protagonist.
Yeah.
You have somebody who is of little words, who kind
the
of
lone gunslinger wandering into town,
who moves from point to point to point. Yeah. And it's all based off of some objective. Like you have to get this and do this and do this and do this, and that's what progresses the story.
But they just did it well, and it is somewhat ironic that that the same man that brought us the not so well received or well constructed Cowboys versus Aliens goes and does a TV series about cowboys and aliens and succeeds completely with it. But yeah, Jon Favreau's. If you've not seen Cowboys versus Aliens, it is a I don't really even know how to. It's not like a terrible movie. It's just an incomprehensible. You're kind of just like, why is any of this happening? With a great cast, and I mean, you're doing Daniel Craig and Harrison Ford. It just how do you not make this work? It's tricky.
I was watching Chef last night actually, and
great flick.
Yeah. It really is funny to watch Jon Favreau just kind of go back to being basically like
an indie filmmaker.
Yeah.
With all of his A-list friends just slumming it for a scene.
Yeah, just slumming it for
I mean, listen, I love the idea also of Jon Favreau as director and writer of this movie, casting as his like ex-wives or love interests. It's like Sofia Vergara and Scarlett Johansson. I'm just like, well, it's good to be a director. It's like
he's shooting for the moon there.
Yeah, there's no casting couch nonsense with him, but he's still gonna like make sure his character on screen, who like can't afford a food truck, is like, I was with Sofia Vergara.
Oh no, that guy has slept with way more attractive women than.
It's insane. But yeah, it is, I think with like the last couple decades of and really in two great versions, it's actually kind of interesting. So you've got 3:10 to Yuma, which is a remake. You've got True Grit, also a really great Western, recent Western, which is a remake. And then you have Tarantino, who's not doing, well, he's sort of doing a remake with Django, but not really. It's more of a just using a character and doing it, but he's also using the Western as a like his throwback of the old school Westerns and stuff. So you have a lot of these very successful ones are pulling from the past.
I was gonna say, I mean, I feel like Tarantino's last film was definitely a straight up Western, which was the Hateful Eight.
Yes.
And, which felt
he did two back to back, Django and Hateful Eight. For kind of his Western. And it's funny because Hateful Eight is. Hateful Eight, I would say is it is technically a Western, but to me it's Tarantino directing a play. Like it feels like him saying, I want a bunch of people in one location, and I mean you could do that on stage very easily.
But that's the idea, is that a lot of Westerns feel like they could be plays to me, so
yeah. It's interesting. I mean, and Django's great. I mean, but it's cartoony Western. But yeah, I really do. I think like that shift around Deadwood, but then you also have kind of these other Western-ish movies, and there again we've got two that come out against each other with No Country for Old Men and There Will Be Blood, which arguably are either of these really
I don't think
Westerns.
So.
I mean, There Will Be Blood. I don't think is a Western, but these are constantly referred or qualified in kind of lists and ideas as Westerns, and it's interesting to me.
So it's ironic that we are watching Midnight Mass right now, because I believe that There Will Be Blood's biblical horror. I really feel like it's like,
I don't think you're wrong with that,
more than it is a Western. And There Will Be Blood.
Or No Country for Old Men. No Country for Old Men is closer to a Western for me.
But it's not. To me, it's still not a Western.
No.
To me, it feels like a cop drama. It feels like a procedural cop drama. It feels like Serpico. It feels like one of those, weird.
But it's doing what Coens do a lot. It uses the scene, like Fargo is not like a Dakotan movie. It's about this other stuff.
And it has Tommy Lee Jones with that whole sort of like thesis statement at the end, which I feel like makes it more of a Western than it should have been.
Well, I mean, Brolin's character is somewhat it's on the fence. I wouldn't necessarily.
I would never like argue with somebody who's saying, "Oh yeah, it's a Western film." I'd be like, "Okay, fine." Sure, it's a Western. But it's to me, it still feels like it's kind of outside of that realm.
Sure. And I think, obviously, we've talked before on the show being fans of Firefly and Serenity. But Firefly is Firefly does what I like best about using, same as Mandalorian, of using the Western archetype, like specifically using it set in a different era, but all of these other little touches. Yeah. The language and the idea of like the mixing of cultures, so that we're getting to see kind of this idea of this future mishmash of things, which is done a lot. It's funny, it's done constantly in sci-fi writing, but I don't see it as much. You get a little bit of it in things like Blade Runner, where you see the Asian influence of kind of this the Pan-American, Pan-Asian combination of this idea in the future really is that you're going to take your two superpowers in your world, and once you reach this space travel and all these other things, they are going to have to merge together and coexist much more than they do now. So there is this blurring of cultures with it, which you do a lot of that in Firefly. But that's another show also that I think the thing that Westerns do a lot, and that I think why people are gravitate towards them, is it's everything in a Western deals with shades of gray. There used to be the idea of the white hat and the black hat, and you're the villain or the hero, but much more it's turned into like, hey, the West sucks, or this is a bad, tough time for everybody. So there is no real pure good guy or real pure bad guy. There's just a lot of people fucking trying to make it. And that means that they're going to do kind of shady, shitty fucking things, even if they're a overall quote unquote good person. And Firefly does that pretty well with Fillion's character, I think.
Yeah, I still remember, I think Lana Wachowski qualified the first Matrix saying, "Oh no, it's a Western." Like that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to have like the silent hero, like the person who's kind of clueless, who's kind of going through trials and tribulations. And they were just like, we're sticking a Western hero inside of an anime movie. And like what happens, and I think that's super telling with that.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, Western finds its way into lots of sci-fi for very good reasons.
And we talked about like martial arts on the last podcast, but like John Woo was like if you look at
John Wick, John Woo. Oh, okay,
John Woo.
I wasn't sure if you were going to talk about John Wick or director John Woo.
No, director John Woo does or did a lot in the late 80s and early 90s, especially, was very much like doing these Western stories, but doing them in these cop drama, like Hong Kong sort of styles. Mm-hmm. And so it was the violence was all very choreographed, gunslinger sort of drama, but it was all based off of, this person double crossed this person. And then, it was all based off of these kind of tropes that had been established in pretty, 1940s, 1950s Western films, which I think that you can probably say, okay, best Western film of all time, Seven Samurai, kind of, maybe, and everything's sort of
Magnificent Seven also.
Magnificent Seven is sort of a,
well,
on that.
And I think there were some ones that were also interesting that were happening in the 90s with this, with like Robert Rodriguez of looking at things like El Mariachi and Desperado and Once Upon a Time in Mexico, which then those popularize Antonio Banderas, and then he goes on to have great success as Zorro. Which is interesting. Is Zorro, the Mask of Zorro, the first one he did, I think is a great. I haven't seen it in years. I just remember it being like a really good crowd pleasing.
Which I believe that film was directed by Kevin Reynolds, who directed Waterworld and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. So
interesting. All comes back. It's kind of interesting that you started to see, like, I think that also has to happen with these genres, that you sometimes you have to have like a somewhat tentpole thing, even though, Zorro has a very different feel than a traditional Western, even though it is tied very much into those Western roots. But I think it's pulling a lot from the success of what Rodriguez had found with El Mariachi and bringing Antonio Banderas into that character. The casting of Anthony Hopkins is slightly suspect, but that's a whole other thing. But yeah, it's I remember that kind of being like a series of movies of like those were things I was starting to gravitate toward in the 90s before I kind of
the casting of Catherine Zeta-Jones was not suspect.
And I have no problems with that casting whatsoever. She's Welsh, yeah, sure, yeah, Welsh Spaniard, yeah, I have no problems with these.
She has a British accent, no problem.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's how this is how things work.
Cut off her bra. Okay.
Yeah, I think that was great. But I know there's another one. There seems to be kind of just these different things you can do in that genre, whether it's going to be something that's more action paced and bombastic, which, you look at something like 3:10 to Yuma is very much something that's built around tension and action. And then you have something like the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, always mouthful of a title. But that's just a great, slow burn, introspective character piece. Using real people from history and two great performances to build out just the quietest electric movie ever.
So yeah, still, I don't think that Brad Pitt will ever be able to do anything better than that as far as a performance is concerned, because he is so magnetic in that movie, and you can feel Casey Affleck's just he just wants to be Brad Pitt.
Yeah, the love affair of that that infatuation is palpable on screen. But I think that's the thing that happens with Westerns, also why you can tell all these different stories, is that it is built into our culture as something that everyone knows. Everyone knows what a cowboy is. Everyone knows the look of these characters. It's why you have something like Westworld, which is a great use of the idea of like people want to go play cowboys. Cowboys really were the superheroes before superheroes. It's the idea of, I put on this hat, I put on this costume, which I don't ever say the word costume around Hoot, which I did by accident once. That does not go over well. But that idea of kind of playing cowboy, and it's also just, it's such fun because every one of these like tiny villages are so much easier for people to create in backlines. So like they all look accurate and the same just because like they're it's easy construction based versus what you would be doing to build stuff now, because it's all just wood and facades, and the rest of it doesn't really matter. But I've always just been kind of tickled by like how many different Western towns we see that are exactly the same, that some of them are on the same lot, some of them are not. They just build tons of these, and then you can shoot a Brady Bunch episode in one. It doesn't matter. Just use whatever you want. It's craziness. I think I was trying to see if there are any more on my list here. Do you have any more?
I really did want to kind of loop around to like Open Range because
sure.
I really felt like what was happening there is in the early 2000s is everyone was making these like super flashy, you know, like it could be a Western by artifice or whatever, like by like outside looking in. But Open Range was just so slow and just so, you know, like methodical about, and you like it was cast for age appropriateness, which I like. I love the fact that it was like Kevin Costner. It was like, yeah, I'm old. And it was like, you know, that became part of the fact that being like, how come you haven't settled down at this point, you know, and him playing against playing
a little against type. Yeah.
I really, really love that movie. And I think it gets looked over a little bit because I feel like nowadays we're seeing kind of a resurgence of the Western, especially for, you know, like you're seeing these films that are kind of popularized, especially with like, what's the one that you mentioned earlier with
Hell or High Water?
Yeah, like Hell or High Water, or even
Bone Tomahawk.
Like even films like Bone Tomahawk or Joe or Mud. Those all have some sort of, you know, Western kind of feel to them, but I feel like the overall aesthetic is kind of coming. It's kind of made a funny like little sneaky comeback.
Yeah, it is very much one of those genres that ebbs and flows, and I think we'll see all kinds of different. You know, it's comfort food in a way. It does, and it's not. I think they've proven now that it won't scare people away. I think Open Range comes out at a difficult time, for a number of reasons. I mean, part of it is that we're post Wild Wild West, which anytime there's a flop, like it's the same as, you know, the Pirates of the Caribbean took years to put together because Cutthroat Island bombed so spectacularly that the studios would not touch. Like, oh, there's a pirate in it. Fuck it. No, the pirates don't work. They're terrible. They're going to bankrupt our studios. So you had fear of that, and then you also had the idea that in 2003, Kevin Costner wasn't the Kevin Costner of the 90s at that point. We're post Waterworld. We're post Postman. You know, it's an interesting time, but I think that's why, you know, that was such a great move for him to be like, okay, I'm gonna resurrect me, and I'm gonna resurrect this thing, just because it's I know this world, I know how to make this work, and I've got to imagine, because of what we're talking about with how they're written, that Westerns are cheap. I can't, you know, it seems to be costumes and a couple of sets. I mean, I know I'm probably being very reductive about that, but
you're being a little reductive. I mean, they built an entire town for Open Range, but it still, you build the town and then you shoot there.
Yeah, and then you sell, and then we're gonna sell that lot to other people to shoot all the rest of their Western shit, so they can like, yeah, it's not like a science fiction movie, and your action is a lot easier. You're dealing with stunt guys and hats, and your biggest budget is probably just the horse work and all wrangling of all that shit. But yeah, it's interesting. That's one I have not thought of in a long time. Maybe I need to do a double feature of Open Range and Dances with Wolves and spend 9 hours in the house.
As long as you invite me for that one,
I will. I would watch either of those again. It's been so long.
Unpopular opinion, though, I think Open Range is actually a better movie than Dances with Wolves, but
I don't really have an allegiance or like major love for either of them, so I'd be very interested in rewatching those and seeing kind of what I think. I mean, like I said, it took me a long time to get out of my version of, you know, I was watching City Slickers and Young Guns, where like those were my cowboy movies, and then I really did, like, I remember like Tombstone and Earp came out like within a year of each other, something like that. And
93 and 94, I think.
And like I remember my brother came back from Tombstone and I was like, how was it? And he's like, lol, from Wings, isn't it? And I was like, that was all he had to say. I was like, oh, okay, I guess that's that. And I was only interested in Kilmer, and then I don't think I really watched either of them until later in like when they were on cable. I eventually got over to them. But yeah, it is an interesting genre. I know my mom is not living in Texas and watching movies constantly with Hoot, who's probably seen Open Range, 100 times and played that on. She's not so much of a fan of the Cowboys stuff, which I've been trying to like get her to maybe watch Mandalorian, and I'm like, I don't know how to describe this because if she gets any whiff of this being a Western, it's all done. Who knows?
I think it's kind of funny, actually, especially I thought about this yesterday, is that who's really good in Tombstone and kind of sells that entire movie is Michael Biehn.
Oh, yeah.
Michael Biehn is such a good bad guy in that movie. And he
Johnny,
does the same...
Johnny...
Yeah.
Rango, Johnny...
Yeah, Johnny Rango.
Johnny Rango.
Yeah. And he does this exact same thing in The Abyss, where he's just like playing a complete asshole who you don't like whatsoever. I'm just like, right now, like I fucking love that guy. Like I want to cast him in everything now. You and my brother share a great love for him. It is funny. He's one of those guys that was in so many huge movies. Huge movies.
A lot of them directed by James Cameron, and then just
imagine that.
Never, even when he was in the huge movies, he wasn't like a household name guy. Like it's one of those very weird.
It's like
things.
He's in the Terminator. No, he's not. That's Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Well,
it's like he always gets overshadowed by like the big.
It's funny because there's a topic I haven't figured out how to do it on air, but I saw this this discussion thread that was talking about actors who, like, the idea of that there can be only one, kind of this Highlander idea, that there are actors who lost out on big careers because there was another actor that was too similar to them. So that, and I think the one that always gets put in there is that because Kevin Costner exists, it's why what's his name from Mark Harmon? It's why Mark Harmon never hit it big. That there can only be one, and they're too close to coexist in the world, and there's a world where Kevin Costner was like killed as a baby, and Mark Harmon is like in all of these movies.
There's a world where Mark Harmon is like, maybe this is heaven.
Yeah. I would love to do an entire podcast of because and that's what I'm trying to think. Who is Bean's, who took his career? Who was the actor then? Is it trying to think who was he was sort of unique in that you could kind of paint whatever you wanted into it and he would just show up and deliver it. I don't know who took his career.
He was a military guy. I think he was in the army and was just,
we've got to figure out who took his career. And then we are going to re-pitch all of the movies with that other actor with him. And we're going to figure out how they would be different. That's the podcast. We'll get it. We'll get there sometime.
Yeah, who knows?
But we do thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed our riveting discussion about Westerns. And like I said, I believe the next episode you will hear, knock on wood, will be our musical episode, for better or for worse. We'll see if Nick's musical is under 2 hours this time. But we'll say it's going to be right around an hour.
I'm betting on the over on that one.
It's going to be just a 3-hour episode of Nick's musical. I'm very curious to see if I can put together what I came up with today and yesterday on my walks.
Actually, musical recommendation. For those who have not heard it, please listen to the new Dead's album. Which was produced by Matt Mahaffey.
Oh.
And it is his wife and a bunch of girls, and it is super awesome.
Deads?
The Deads.
The Deads. I don't know this band, but I will add it to my weird workout mix. I've been getting a lot of apparently on the rotation. I've been getting a lot of Get Up Kids. So every time I just assume that I'm listening to a Ben track by accident. I'm like, is this Gadwell Lane? And then I realize, this is
the Get Up Kids.
The Get Up Kids. And it sounds exactly like Ben Wilson. It cracks me up every time.
Hey, listen, I do my best.
It is. I mean, it makes me smile. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Cheers.